Watauga Arts Council with your host, Cherry Johnson, serving arts in Watauga County for more than 30 years.
Hi, I'm Cherry Johnson with Watauga County Arts Council, and lately I've been talking to some folks I know about a book I've discovered, and they've been really fascinated by this, and I think you're going to be too. I'd like to introduce the author to you. This is Birgitta MacGaillard.
Hi, how are you?
Hi, doing well, doing well. It's great for you to come in and join us today.
Well, thank you for having me.
And you also were one of our featured artists at our second Saturday celebration in July.
Yes, I was.
And you kept a busy corner.
I tried to anyway.
Birgitta is a very interesting lady in the first place, but her story is very interesting as well, and that's part, I'm sure, of what makes her such a fascinating person to talk to. Her book is called Lives Divided. This is your first
Yes,
book.
it is.
And it's not a novel.
No, it's not.
And it's not short stories either.
No, it's not. It's a true story.
It's a true story. It's your story.
It's my story and my family's story.
Okay, let's talk about you and your family. Now, you have a very interesting background. Let's talk about starting right before you were born and tell how all this happened.
Yes, my mother is Swedish and my father was Austrian, and the two of them somehow got together sometime in the 30s, got married. My father became an Austrian diplomat, and then after the annexation of Austria, he joined the German embassy in Stockholm. And as a result of that, he continued and was then transferred to Berlin and eventually to Sofia, Bulgaria. And that's where it all went wrong, because once Bulgaria, a former ally of Germany's, then declared war on Germany, the diplomats that were stationed there all became persona non grata, which means that they were ousted, basically. Mm-hmm. And they tried to escape and get across to Turkey, but somehow the Soviets found out about it and were very anxious to get hold of these German diplomats. And the train got intercepted, and the diplomats were all brought back. There was about 40 of them, and they were all brought back to Sofia and then eventually brought to Moscow. And my father spent there 5 or 6 years, and then was handed down a sentence of 25 years of hard labor for espionage. Well,
right. And in the meantime, you and your mother and
yes.
her children.
Yes, mother was then pregnant with me, and after heavy bombardments in Sofia in early January of 1944, my father somehow managed to get us on a plane back to Austria.
This before he was
before he was captured. And that was in the nick of time, or we would probably have been caught up behind the Iron Curtain in Bulgaria, because it became very communistic, as you know. And but as a result, I was born in Austria. My father got the telegram that he had a third daughter, and a few days afterwards, that was when it all happened in September. My mother survived the war in Austria, and then eventually found out about the Swedish Red Cross picking up Swedish women and children, and getting them back to Sweden if they wanted to. And that's how we ended up back in Sweden in 1945 at the end of the war.
Where you joined her family.
Yes, where we joined my grandfather and grandmother at their house. And so that's basically where I was growing up, and we didn't know anything specifically what had happened to my father. We only knew that the Soviets had him, and that was all we knew.
So your mother did know he had been taken
Yes,
back.
She knew that. And then, of course, everything was dissolved after the war was over, and she couldn't get no help from the German government because the German government didn't exist anymore.
Right.
So then it wasn't until 1951 that 50, basically, that we heard from a returning prisoner of war who had seen my father in Soviet Union, and that was in Siberia in Vorkuta. And that's how we knew that he was in Siberia. That was the only thing we knew.
Right.
So for a while there, for a couple of years, we knew that we were aware of where he was. But then a couple of years later, after that, another returning prisoner of war claimed in court, in front of a jury, or not jury, but swore in court that he had seen my father and had buried him in the tundra. And so now my father was officially declared dead. And it was another year or so before my mother then eventually met somebody else and was getting ready to get married and was on the way to get engaged when another prisoner of war returned and said no, he had seen my father in 1953, 54, or 1953, because this all happened at the end of 1953. So as a result, my mother, without telling us, went down to Germany because she wanted to confront the people who had claimed to have seen him, and found out, yes, they truly had been together with my father, so obviously my father was not dead. Well, what happened, this was a very unusual occurrence in Sweden because nobody in Sweden had been involved in the war. And so nobody had lost a father or a brother or anybody, basically. And so it went through the press, and they liked to photograph the little girl, which was me, who had never seen her father. And I was, that was kind of caught the imagination of the people, the little girl. And so then about basically a year and a half went by with just some cards being exchanged. We did get a direct card from my father, and it took another half a year before we got a second card, and so on and so forth. And then eventually he was released in 1955, and he came home.
Now, where did you see him the first time?
He came to Sweden 2 months after he was released. He had to get reorganized and resituated, and then he came back up to Sweden. He had already met my mother, of course, and my oldest sister, and then he met the two of us, my middle sister and myself.
Wow. And how did that feel?
It felt absolutely wonderful, absolutely wonderful, because I had always longed to have a father who would love me, and I was at a very impressionable age, 11. My older sister was already 19, and so she was basically out of the house, beginning nursing school. My middle sister was a teenager who wasn't quite sure of, what to make of a father who was now going to come home and tell her what she could and couldn't do. Whereas I was just 11 years old, so he had the greatest influence over me from that moment on.
Sure.
So from the first moment that I saw him coming down the train station, I jumped into his arms, and I've always claimed that's where I stayed. I felt nestled and comfortable and at home with my father from the first moment. Yes, I knew he was my father.
Yeah.
And so it was a wonderful, wonderful occasion. And it's a moment I'll never, never, ever forget.
So this book is telling it from your perspective?
Yes, it is. Yes. It tells, because when I was starting first grade in Sweden, I never even thought about the fact that anything was different about my family. To me, I knew my father was captured by the Russians. I knew I was born in Austria, and I knew all those circumstances, but it wasn't until my classmates, because I used the wrong word, I told them that he was in prison, and so they thought he was a criminal. Yes, and because of that, my first day was like a nightmare.
Yeah.
And that set me on the path of discovery, and that's what I recapture in the book, the feelings that I went through, what I tried to discover. Obviously, I've done it from an adult point of view, but writing it in the perspective of going back in time and remembering what it was like as a 7, 8, 9, 10-year-old, and then finally as an 11-year-old when he came home.
That will be interesting to read. I'm looking forward to actually reading this book and getting really intimately involved with it. I think it's a fascinating story. And then you and your father had a good bit of time together.
Yes, we certainly did.
Yeah.
Yes, we certainly did.
And your mother as well for many years.
Yes, yeah.
And you guys ended up here?
Well, that's also, my father re-entered the German Foreign Service, and a year after his return, we went to Germany. I became a German citizen after changing a couple of other times, which is a story in and of itself. And a year after that, after just learning German, he was transferred to Toronto, Canada, and I was a teenager at that point. So I spent my teenage years in Toronto, and of course fell in love with the North American continent. When I had to move back to Germany with him, I was a very unhappy girl. So a few years later, after I did my university studies in Sweden, and my father got transferred to Atlanta, Georgia, as German Consul General,
Right.
I immediately signed on board. I'm coming.
Now, you told me that your father's responsible for a lot of business that's going on in this country
Yes,
these
that's
days.
right. That's right. Because he was Consul General in the early 70s, and at that time, Atlanta has still not, become an international city, but was on the verge of becoming so. And Father, being very interested in trade, because that was his forte, his strength, he encouraged trade between Germany and America.
Right.
And so as a result, there was a lot of German businesses that sprung up along the corridor, the 85 corridor, from Atlanta and Greenville, South Carolina. And he was responsible for that, I think, and inviting Governor Carter at that time, to go to Germany. And then there was a, close work between the two. Between Georgia and Germany as well. And at one point, Germany even wanted to close the consulate in Germany, in Atlanta. But my father wrote a report and said, no, don't do that, because Atlanta is up and coming. And as a result, and we have seen the results of that.
Look what happened. Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, did your father end up, I know when he died, was he here in the United States? Or?
No, after he retired in 75, he went back to Sweden, where we had that cottage that I described in the book. And then they tore that cottage down and built the house that is now standing, because he and my mother retired there.
And wanted to have a place.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's right. Because that is the place that we kind of called centrally, to be our home, away from home.
So this story is told with a real passion, because it's really yours.
Oh, yes, absolutely, yes.
I think it's so interesting, the story, Birgitta's story, and then I understand there's another version, or another sequel, I guess, coming out to this,
I
which
hope
is your
so.
father's memoirs.
Right.
And you're going to take those and
try to work them into either partially translated, but not really, because if you know anything about the German language, you know how long the sentences can be. And so if you translate it directly, I don't think many Americans, I don't think many Americans are going to read that.
Yeah, so you're going to make it readable.
Yes, that's right. That's what I'm trying to do. I'm going to try to do.
So it's going to be a very interesting version from his perspective.
That's right. That's right.
Of what happened in this same time frame.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, his memoirs, do they go on beyond the war and beyond his imprisonment?
No.
Okay.
And in fact, they stop a little short, because he didn't start his memoirs until he was retired. And then he was busy building the house with his own hands.
Right.
And so it wasn't until he was in his 70s that he actually started writing.
Wow.
And he didn't quite finish it before he had a stroke in '89 and died.
So you're going to have to add that part for him.
Yes, except that the letters that people wrote to Mother tells what happened to Father in that part, in those years.
Okay.
And so the story is complete, because I've also heard him tell about what happened.
Right. So you can just relate
yes,
that.
I can just relate that somehow.
That's very interesting. I think that's going to be so interesting. So
Well, I think so.
I
hope
look
so.
forward to it. Now, your book is already out on the market.
Yes,
it's
it is.
available several places.
Yes, it is.
Where all is it?
Art Walk and Art
Ridge Art
Space.
Space.
Art Space. And perhaps at Black Bear Market. I'm still working on that. And of course on Amazon.com, and they can also call me directly.
And you're working on it becoming a Kindle type book, or an
yes,
ebook.
it is. Yeah, yeah. That's going to take a little while, and with all the foreign words in there, that do have a glossary, but still, it's going to be a little trickier than just a straightforward uploading or downloading or whatever the word is.
Yeah.
To e-format.
So a lot of background work.
Right.
To do.
Yeah.
So, well, you certainly have your work cut out for you, don't you?
Yes, I do. Besides being a mother and grandmother and wife.
You're a retired teacher yourself.
Yes,
you
I
taught
am.
foreign language.
Yes.
And you came to the States. How did you get to North Carolina?
Well, my husband is from Nebo, down the mountain here. And we met at South Georgia College, where I was teaching French and German, and he was teaching mathematics.
Ah, okay.
And so we got married, and of course we stayed in the South, and then he eventually came back up here. So we've been in Boone since 1980.
He was a professor at the
Yes,
college.
he's a professor at ASU.
He still is.
Yes, he works part-time now.
He's on that
gone through
phased retirement thing?
Yes, he worked through that, and now he still can't let it go quite.
You know, I know a lot of professors like that. It's their life.
Yeah.
Well, I look forward to reading this book, and I know you do too. I hope that you'll get a chance to meet Birgitta. Do you have some times when you're going to be signing books soon?
Yes, I think there's going to be a book signing down in Hudson at Hudson Baptist Church on August the 15th at 7 p.m. And then I'll be at the Bookmark in Winston-Salem on September 7th. And I don't know any other well, in October at the Oktoberfest.
Well, that's great. Well, we'll definitely keep in touch. You've got a website.
Yes, I do.
And so we'll offer you that link, and you can also go through the Arts Council's website as well, watauga-arts.org, and you can learn about this and a whole lot more.
Yes.
Watauga Arts Council with your host, Cherry Johnson, serving arts in Watauga County for more than 30 years.